Earlier this week in Ohio, the Republican-controlled House passed a bill dubbed the Enact the Indecent Exposure Modernization Act that will now move to the Senate for potential implementation, and which essentially bans drag and gender-related performances outside adult cabaret venues or anywhere that there might be kids. But, of course, it's really about a lot more than that, as the bill is stated to contain language targeting people who express a gender different to the sex that they were assigned at birth. Yep, it's just more trans persecution, dressed up as protecting children, from the party both headed up by a guy who was besties with a known pedo, and that brought you such fine, upstanding citizens as former South Carolina State Republican R.J. May, who was sentenced to 17 years in prison in January for distributing child sex abuse material. It would have been a longer sentence, but he was committing his crimes in a gender-appropriate suit and tie. Meanwhile, in the UK, both young trans people and older members have until September to leave the Girl Guides, because the organisation said it was scared of repercussions resulting from last year's stupid, blinkered, and willfully uninformed Supreme Court ruling about biological sex. Which is bullshit, especially when they could have just changed their name to something more widely inclusive and have done with it. Back in the US, books about LGBTQ experiences are removed from military and school libraries, and powerful individuals like Supreme Court Justice Clarence Thomas, a supreme piece of shit, advocates for overturning a ruling that legalized same-sex marriage. This on a Supreme Court heavily weighted towards the conservative right that has already reversed the law on abortion. So this sort of shit, it's no joke. And just across the world in general, homosexuality can still lead to a prison sentence or even execution. So what do these things tell us? Well, apart from the obvious, that Christian conservatives, Republicans, far-right agitators, manosphere incels and theocrats everywhere are a massive bunch of assholes, they tell us what we already know, that sexuality is still very much on the front line of the battle to control the individual human will. Clearly, there are plenty of ways that governing and non-governing ideologies with delusions of hegemonic grandeur attempt to subsume the individual. There's the censorship of art and culture, controlling the narrative a society has to describe itself. And of course, there's the denegation of freedom of speech, which is intimately associated with the move to crush all aspects of freedom of human expression, the ultimate goal of which is to leave society with no mechanism to communicate other than that sanctioned by its rulers, nipping dissent in the bud and ensuring the continuation of the imposed status quo. But there's something special about sex, isn't there? Perhaps it has something to do with the fact that sexuality can be construed as the most private expression of the self, as close to a physical representation of freedom of thought and character as there is. Control sexuality, hopeful dictators think, and you control everything. Own a person's sexuality, and you own the person. Now, if anybody thinks that dictating the sexual narrative as a means of social control is just the deluded stuff of paranoid dystopian fantasy, then do yourself a favour and talk to almost any woman. Here we are, a quarter of the way through the 21st century, and the major governing legislative body in an apparently modern democratic society still thinks it has the right to tell a woman what she can and cannot do with her own body. Yes, abortion is more an example of biological gender fascism than it is gender identity fascism, but it's still fascism. The key word here is identity. We define ourselves in many ways. The music we like, the books we read, the clothes we wear, our politics and our philosophy, and all the rest. But, arguably more than all of those other things, we self-identify through our sexuality. And it is precisely that, our ability to self-identify, which becomes the target. A true dictatorship cannot allow its citizens to do as they please, to choose who and what they are, to choose who they love. You are what the hegemony dictates. Anything else is a direct threat. Anything else is dangerous sedition. What happens when a woman freely admits to enjoying sex? Okay, maybe, not as much as might have happened 70 years ago, but still plenty enough to be embarrassing to a supposedly civilized society. Again, you only need to dip your toe into the manosphere to hear the rabid, misogynistic grunts and squeals about women's role in the world. Wankers. When a man shouts about his exploits, as long as those exploits are heteronormative, then he's a stud, a hero, a manly man, a model to which all other men should aspire. A woman, though, well, that's a slag. The kind of woman you just can't trust, morally loose and unreliable, not mother material. The role that she has been so kindly assigned by biology and one rigidly backed up by culture. She is a threat to the patriarchal system that has kept women in their place for hundreds of years. A woman who controls herself, goes the manosphere thinking, represents a man who has lost control. A woman in control of her own sexuality, her own sexual destiny, can no longer be classified, importantly, as somebody's property. Female emancipation was a challenge to established male domination. So what luck for the ruling patriarchs to allow women the vote, to offer them a wage, though not an equal one, and all the other perks of living, but also to keep their sexuality tied to their virtue, to keep a woman's sexuality tied to her worth, so that any sexual activity that fell outside of the norm set down for her by men would see her shamed or ostracized. That attitude is far from gone. Even mainstream pop culture's apparent embrace of LGBTQ until recently was one couched in the male narrative, which is why we got used to seeing plenty of gay men on TV, but not so many gay women. This is changing, but it's interesting to note how the guys could still be the guys, because heterosexual men could still at least harbour the backward notion that a preponderance of homosexual men meant more totty for the real fellas, more property to be shared out. A shaky fantasy that crumbled in the face of an actual lesbian relationship, the ultimate expression of a manly man's essentially non-essential nature. Then we have organised religion's stance on sexuality, which has pretty much bled through the millennia to inform a great deal of the socio-political stance on sexuality, mainly thanks to a great many people refusing to evolve any further than their simplistic, blinkered, superstitious belief in a capricious and prudish giant magic sky pixie or variation thereof. A being of such apparent infinite power that it can create an entire universe, yet incredibly so squeamishly sensitive that the wrong sexy bits of a comparatively tiny and insignificant creature in the wrong sockets are enough to send it into paroxysms of incoherent rage. Organised religion gets particularly upset at the LGBTQ community, though it is much, much worse in some places than it is in others. Before organised religion came along, I find it easy to imagine people fucking absolutely everything and anything without a care in the world. Then, along comes some maniac, probably driven crazy by the fact that in the midst of all this carnal abandon, he isn't getting any of it, and tells everyone that he has the ear of God and that from now on, certain sexual activities are to be punished. I used to wonder if the whole problem of gay love for organised religion was the pretty severe block it put on going forth and multiplying. It must be quite hard to fight a holy war if you don't have the numbers on your side. For that, you need a whole bunch of brainwashed babies to grow up believing your version of the creation myth. Same-sex coupling is generally not so good at baby production. And maybe that did have something to do with it, but at the core, it was all about two things: limiting pleasure and increasing misery. To make life after death more attractive than actual living, and making sure people knew who was boss, reminding them, in fact, that there was such a thing as a boss. Sex and gender is freedom. It is the shaking off of all the cultural and rational baggage of everyday existence. Think about how you feel at the moment of climax, how that orgasm transforms you into an entity that is both at once physical and beyond physical. A glimpse into the wider pool outside of your own skin. That's dangerous stuff to someone who wants to control your existence, who wants to govern your nature. What's the point of cultural hegemony if those whose lives you rule over can simply go home and fuck themselves free? It'll put ideas in their heads. So, much better then to denounce certain acts and desires and to build up a society of fear and disgust around these things, to introduce shame and judgment, to back up body control with thought control. Denying a person the right to freely express their sexuality is denying them the right to be who they really are. It's oppression, plain and simple. And in a society that calls itself free, there can be no greater crime against the individual will. Oppression of sexuality is oppression of the individual.